In this video, we're going to talk about the 1979 film Mad Max. And many would argue that this is, unambiguously, inarguably, one of the greatest film franchises to come out of the Australian New Wave film system. And it marks the beginning of the Mad Max franchise, the rise of Australian cinema, and the rise of a post-apocalyptic steampunk genre. It's also the rise of actor Mel Gibson, as well as the rise of director George Miller. And here we get the humble origins of what will become a top-tier franchise, inspiring an entire post-apocalyptic steampunk genre, which will be the staple of movies and comic books and video games for the next 50 years and beyond. Now, George Miller himself was inspired by iconic films such as the 1975 A Boy and His Dog, and other influences included films like The Omega Man, Planet of the Apes, and many Twilight Zone episodes. And now Mad Max is a huge influence on other modern properties. Think of all the movies and video games that Mad Max would inspire. Games and TV franchises like The Walking Dead, BioShock, Horizon Zero Dawn, A Quiet Place, The Last of Us, Fallout, Silo, just to name a few. All of these films have so many elements that resemble elements from the Mad Max films. In fact, you really can't make a post-apocalyptic genre movie without at least addressing some of the visual elements that came from Mad Max. Mad Max would be followed up with the brilliant Mad Max 2 The Road Warrior, and then followed up with Mad Max 3 Beyond Thunderdome. Then, after 30 years, George Miller shocked the world in 2015 with Mad Max Fury Road, instantly reviving the dormant brand and being nominated for an Academy Award for Best Picture. Then in the summer of 2024, we got the release of the fifth Mad Max film, Mad Max Furiosa, which unfairly bombed in the theaters last year, although you have to question the decision to make a Mad Max movie without Mad Max, as well as a Furiosa movie without Charlize Theron. Still, I did feel that movie was a solid piece of entertainment. So when director George Miller wrote and directed Mad Max and Mad Max 2, he was a complete unknown amateur filmmaker. But by Mad Max 3 Beyond Thunderdome, he was a Hollywood up-and-comer, and today George Miller is Hollywood royalty. He wrote and directed and produced a movie called Lorenzo's Oil, and he also wrote and produced Babe, the Talking Pig movie, and he also wrote, directed, and produced Babe 2, Pig in the City. And then he wrote, directed, and produced the two Happy Feet films, the one with the dancing penguin. He's been nominated for 3 Academy Awards, and actually won an Academy Award in 2006 for Best Animated Feature for Happy Feet. And then in 2007, he was slated to direct the new Justice League movie called Justice League Mortal, with Armie Hammer's Batman, DJ Cotrona as Superman, and Adrian Brody as The Flash. But Warner Brothers ended up pulling the plug on that project because they didn't want to dilute Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight franchise. But what I would do to see that movie. Now, I saw this Mad Max movie for the first time only a few years ago. And I actually saw these movies in reverse order. I was a kid and I saw Mad Max 3 Beyond Thunderdome in 1985 as a teenager in the theaters when it came out. And I loved that movie and I was completely blown away by it. Although I didn't understand why some of my older friends kept saying that the other Mad Max films were so much better. Well, in college, I tried to go back and watch the earlier Mad Max films. And unfortunately, rather than renting The Road Warrior, I accidentally rented this movie. And I had no idea the context of this film and how it was made, so I remember I couldn't sit through it. And unfortunately, I also rented the one where they dubbed all the voices. So you had this really bad dubbing for Mel Gibson. And it just seemed so low budget. And to be honest, I only made it about halfway through. Then in my late 20s, around 1997, I was at Blockbuster Video and I rented The Road Warrior. And I vividly remember the Blockbuster clerk complimenting me on my wise rental choice. And then when I saw it, I was totally mesmerized by The Road Warrior. And it soon became one of my favorite films and on my list of rewatchable movies. I bought the VHS right away. And so I didn't actually watch this film, this first Mad Max film, until 2015 when Mad Max Fury Road was coming out. And because at that time I decided to watch the entire Mad Max franchise in order, and it was here I learned about how this 1979 movie got made. Now for us US audiences, it was the sequel, the 1981 Mad Max 2 The Road Warrior, that was first released in the US as simply The Road Warrior. And then this first film, the 1979 Mad Max film, was released after the success of The Road Warrior. Now I do plan to make videos on all of the Mad Max movies. What actually got me to really understand the 1979 Mad Max movie was that around this time, about 2015, I actually accidentally stumbled upon this movie on Netflix called Not Quite Hollywood, the wild untold story of Ozploitation. And it was an old 2008 Australian documentary by Mark Hartley about the Australian New Wave of the 1970s and 1980s. And the documentary talked about how the Australian New Wave was cranking out these low-budget movies, basically Australia's analog to the American grindhouse films. And it was an awesome documentary, and it really opened my eyes to this entire genre of filmmaking. I actually learned that I was probably a little more familiar with Australian New Wave than I'd previously thought, because there's the Saw films, which are officially Australian New Wave, but also the old Howling films, the movie Walkabout, as well as Mad Max, and hundreds of other films that I was actually familiar with. So from this documentary, I learned that Mad Max was an unforeseen surprise mega hit, and lead actor Mel Gibson just became an unexpected film icon. And it was more than just a successful Australian New Wave film, it sort of changed the international perspective of Australian cinema. And of course the next film, Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, was even bigger. And that film is actually going to ultimately transcend Ozploitation itself and become a phenomenon so big that it was actually sort of define Australian cinema. So after seeing that documentary, I understood a little bit more about the historical context of this film. I understood a little more about the historical context that the film was made in, and I became a little more fascinated with Mad Max. So if you watch this film knowing that it was an independent film made outside the Australian film studio system, and it was made by a first-time director with money he earned on his own, well, armed with this knowledge, it does make the movie better. So context is important. Now you have to realize that this was intended to be a grindhouse film. It's a simple revenge exploitation film that just happens to include subtle nuanced levels if you choose to look for them. And of course you have to watch this movie with the original Australian voices. Don't even bother listening to that American dub movie, because it's very poorly dubbed. If you have the American dub version, I recommend, you can maybe keep it as a collector's item, but I jokingly say just throw it out and buy the original Australian voices. So this movie is directed by George Miller, and George Miller graduated from medical school in Australia, and he was doing his residency training at Sydney Hospital in emergency medicine. However, being an emergency medicine doctor would take a back seat to his primary dream of one day becoming a movie director. And he took a summer film school course, and there he met amateur filmmaker Byron Kennedy, and the two of them became friends. Now, George Miller and Byron Kennedy were an interesting pair, because on the surface, they were two completely different temperaments and dispositions. George Miller was warm and friendly and had an outgoing personality that made people feel comfortable. On the other hand, Byron Kennedy was quiet and intense and very offbeat, and he would often make people uncomfortable just by being in the room with him. And he was kind of a weird guy. However, George Miller and Byron Kennedy were extremely good friends, and when it came to movies, they were completely on the same frequency. People who worked with them said it was as if they had one mind. And so the two together made a short 20-minute student film called Violence in Cinema Part 1, and the film was actually a spoof of cinema violence. It wasn't a documentary as the title implied, but it was kind of in that fake documentary genre, and it was actually a feature film for about 20 minutes with a plot about a history professor teaching a course on film history violence until the course turns into a bloody horror film. It was a very clever story, and it was entered into a number of film festivals and actually won several awards. And so the two remained good friends. 8 years later, when George Miller had already become a doctor and was making some good money, the two decided to make a full-length feature film, and that film would eventually become Mad Max. George Miller was working on the casualty unit of the emergency room, and he would see people brought in, and they would be in horrible shape. And he began to use his imagination about what situation might have caused these horrific accidents. And one day he'd hoped that he could make a movie about those scenarios. Now, Byron Kennedy himself was specifically a fan of American movies, and he didn't really care for Australian films or films from other cultures. Byron Kennedy hated dialogue in movies, and he really loved action. And that's why he loved American movies. And when he became interested in filmmaking, he really wanted to make an Australian movie that had that American movie feel. And that was their mission, to make a movie that resembled an American Hollywood action film. And ultimately, they wanted to make a movie for the American audience. So George Miller raised most of the money by himself by, number one, meeting with various doctor friends and getting them to invest in his movie, and two, doing overtime local tenants work at local emergency rooms. And after 18 months of fundraising, he was able to raise $400,000, and they used that money to start production on their Mad Max movie. And while the movie was in pre-production, George Miller continued to work extra shifts, and he was able to earn an additional $200,000, bringing the total budget of their new film to around $600,000. $200,000 of it being kind of a cushion. And then one day, George Miller met James McCausland at a party where McCausland was a journalist who wrote financial news. However, McCausland was a huge movie buff, and when he and George Miller met, they totally hit it off and became friends. And George Miller had this idea that most of the best screenwriters that he learned about all came from the field of journalism. And therefore, he thought James McCausland might be the perfect person to help him write the screenplay for his next movie. And he asked McCausland, who initially thought Miller was crazy, but the more they talked, the more he became intrigued, and the more he thought about it, he decided, well, let's go for it. James McCausland and George Miller were fascinated on modern society's dependence on oil. And McCausland was impacted by the 1973 oil crisis. Now, the 1973 oil crisis caused oil shortages where people were standing in lines at gas stations. And this is a time in our history when OPEC, aka the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, at that time was Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Ecuador. These nations decided to start an oil embargo against the United States for the American involvement in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And the embargo was very effective, and it demonstrated Saudi Arabia's diplomatic and economic power in the world. And crude oil prices, which was actually had been $3 a barrel for years, suddenly jumped to $10 a barrel, and even at times was $12 a barrel. And Americans began to see the effects of this embargo at regular gas prices. So ever since the 1940s, gas cost about 30 cents a gallon at the gas station and remained that way in the 1950s and the 1960s and even to the 1970s. And until 1973, when gas prices slowly climbed up from 1974 and continued to climb to $1 a gallon in 1979. So that's 3 to 4 times more than gas was worth the previous year. And from 1979, it stayed there around $1 a gallon. And incidentally, gas prices stayed there for over 20 years until the year 2000. Now currently, crude oil prices are around $50 a barrel, and in January 2015, oil prices were around $2 a gallon. Oil actually peaked in 2008 when it reached a record $140 a barrel, causing gas to reach $4 a gallon at the gas station, then leveled off to about $2 a gallon. Well, now it's 2025, 25 years later, and we see that price hike happening now where gas seems to be jumping to around $3.50 to about $4 a gallon. Well, back to Mad Max. So James McCausland and George Miller, the screenwriters, envisioned a future where oil production had stopped, and he began to think how dramatically this would affect our modern society, and even began to wonder to what extent people would go through to obtain oil. And that's the future that the Mad Max universe is set in. So George Miller had the general outline for the story and had the general plot, whereas James McCausland would be in charge of writing the dialogue. And the two collaborated back and forth until the screenplay was completed. And when the screenplay was done, it was over 214 pages long. Now, this does not mean that the movie was 214 minutes long. The rule of thumb is that 1 page equals 1 minute of screen time. The reason why the screenplay was so long was that George Miller and James McCausland put a lot of detail of the scene into the screenplay because they knew that they didn't have a lot of budget. So ideally, they knew that every shot had to be completed in one take. So by having everything pre-planned to the last detail on the screenplay page, that would allow the scene to be filmed easily in one take. The multiple takes were on the screenplay. George Miller and James McCausland finished the script and showed it to the Australian movie industry, and everyone was blown away. They loved it. They loved the incredible dialogue that McCausland had written. And everyone thought it had a professional sounding dialogue of a movie written by a Hollywood veteran, not a first-time untrained screenwriter. It seemed that George Miller's hunch about journalists being good screenwriters ended up being spot on. Initially, George Miller wanted to hire an American actor to play the lead, Max. After all, he was trying to create a Hollywood-style film. However, he realized that to get a known American actor would basically break their budget, so he decided to go with a local actor. And Miller's first choice was an actor named James Healy, who had already been in a few police procedurals. And he was a known name and was early in his career, so that he would have been cheap, and he also had Hollywood leading man good looks. However, after reading the script, Healy turned down the project because the dialogue was too sparse and wouldn't give him enough lines to act. Now, incidentally, James Healy would go on to be a regular on the show Dynasty, playing a character named Sean Rowan. Now, the two, George Miller and Byron Kennedy, began casting, and one of the actors auditioned was Mel Gibson. And Mel Gibson was a new actor, and he'd really only been in one film. Now there's considerable apocryphal lore involving how Mel Gibson got the part. Now according to this lore, during auditions, Mel Gibson actually got drunk the night before and even had a bar fight and had this completely bruised face, swollen nose, and even a broken jaw, and he didn't expect to get the part. He actually went to the audition just to accompany one of his close friends, Steve Bisley, who actually landed the part of Jim Goose. However, the producer saw him with his banged up face and just said, "Hey, come back next week because we need a lot of freaks for the background." So a few weeks later, he showed up and his face was healed and he was looking all handsome, and the producers liked his look and they hired him for the lead. Now apparently, for the longest time, this was an actual story that was circulating around Hollywood. However, it is not true. It was completely made up. In reality, the story is much less interesting. Mel Gibson and Steve Bisley were actually friends and classmates, and they did indeed audition together. George Miller was very impressed with Mel Gibson and his audition, and everyone on the production was impressed with first how handsome Mel Gibson was, and how the camera just seemed to love him, but they were also impressed that he could act and had this commanding voice. And everyone felt that this unknown actor, Mel Gibson, was an incredibly lucky find, and everyone knew they had a future superstar on their hands. So Mel Gibson was cast as Max Rockatansky, and his buddy Steve Bisley was cast as Jim Goose. Mel Gibson was actually born in New York. Mel Gibson was American, but at age 12, his parents emigrated to Australia, where Mel Gibson grew up. And Mel Gibson studied acting at the National Institute of Dramatic Arts in Sydney, Australia, where he became a respected stage actor in student productions. And after graduation, he had minor roles on low-budget movies and 2 TV shows. But of course, it's going to be this movie, Mad Max, and especially the sequel, The Road Warrior, that's going to be his first major starring role, and it's going to propel him to superstar fame. And he's going to parlay his brilliant acting career starring in the Lethal Weapon franchise and into an even more brilliant directing career with the 1995 Braveheart, 2004 Passion of the Christ, and 2006 Apocalypto. However, in the previous 2 decades, Mel Gibson got himself canceled even before being canceled was a thing. He was accused of allegedly making anti-Semitic statements to a police officer, and he was accused of yelling at his girlfriend while drunk. And for a while, he was one of the most shunned celebrities in Hollywood. And he became this cautionary tale of the type of cancellation that can befall you if you sort of step out of line. And he did make a small comeback in 2016 with the brilliant Hacksaw Ridge, but you can argue that he never quite got his career back on track. Well, now it's 2025, and Mel Gibson, who's now 69 years old, and with decades of maturity, sobriety, and reflection, he's no longer the hot-headed 40-year-old that got himself canceled. Now furthermore, we're sort of in this post-cancellation age, and we're seeing more and more of Mel Gibson in interviews and TV spots, and I'm excited to see the return of Mel Gibson, and I want to see him return to his former glory, and I'm also excited to see what movies that he'll make for us. Now for the role of the main villain Toecutter, they cast Hugh Keys-Byrne, and Byrne was a large giant of a man with this intense demeanor, and he was also an experienced veteran stage actor. And Hugh Keys-Byrne had this very imposing presence and easily established himself as the undisputed leader of this method acting bicycle gang. And this gang stayed in character even when they weren't filming, and he remained the leader of this gang at all times. And one of the things that Hugh Keys-Byrne did was to use a slightly different accent in every scene of this movie. In one scene, he might have an English accent. In the next scene, he'd have a subtle German accent, and so forth. And it created an offbeat and uncomfortable sense every time we see Toecutter on screen. And Hugh Keys-Byrne would return decades later as Immortan Joe in a 2015 sequel, Mad Max Fury Road. Now, Mad Max was made on an ultra-low budget, and they saved money everywhere they could. Therefore, according to lore, they could only afford to make 2 leather outfits for the main characters, one for Max and one for Jim Goose, and the rest of the cast on the police force had to have this really cheap vinyl outfits. Well, this is actually not true. The truth is, everyone on the police force had vinyl suits, including Mel Gibson, and the only one who got a leather suit was Steve Bisley, who played Goose, because his character rode a motorcycle, and it would have been unsafe for him to ride a bicycle without a leather outfit. So his leather outfit was purely for safety reasons. Well, these vinyl outfits turned out to be quite a problem in the Australian summer heat. And Mel Gibson remembers it being very hot in those outfits, and it was even hotter against the vinyl seats of the car. And some cast members said that by the end of the day's shooting, their underwear was completely drenched in sweat. And here's some other facts that'll really give you an idea of how low budget this movie was, and how little money they had making this film. So the art production designer was named John Dowdy, and he tells a story in an interview where that scene where Mad Max and his wife go to an ice cream store. Well, they couldn't afford to make the ice cream store signs, so John Dowdy actually passed by an ice cream shop, went back at midnight, stole the signs, they filmed the scene, and then they returned the sign the next day. And no one was wiser. And that's the kind of stuff they did in order to make this movie. Now, most of the money budgeted for this movie actually went to the cars and the stunts, and the crashes. And the main car in this film was the yellow Interceptor, driven by the police, which was actually made from a 1974 Ford Falcon. And they actually used to be old police cars that were decommissioned and sold cheap for this project. And Max's yellow Interceptor was a 1974 Ford Falcon XB sedan, also previously an old Victorian police car. And the Big Bopper, driven by Rupe and Charlie, was also a 1974 Ford Falcon XB, also formerly a Victorian police car. The March Hare, driven by Sarcy and Scuttle, was a 1972 Ford Falcon XA, and that was actually an old Melbourne taxicab. And Max's Black Pursuit Special was a 1973 Ford XB Falcon GT 351, a limited edition hardtop that was sold in Australia from 1973 to 1976. Now, a huge benefit for this movie came when they were able to get a local Kawasaki dealership to donate 14 free Kawasaki motorcycles for the project. George Miller had this vision to make the film look like Clint Eastwood's The Man with No Name trilogy, and you can see the influence in the look and color of Mad Max. And George Miller also decided to do something unusual and controversial when filming the action sequences. He had the camera be at street level, giving the audience a sense of immersion during the action. Now, filming took place in and around Melbourne, Australia. And the actors hired for the movie were mostly from Sydney, and they had to get to Melbourne, which was about 1,000 miles southwest of Sydney. And the cast who played Toecutter's gang had this idea to save money for the production crew. They would simply ride their motorcycles from Sydney to Melbourne. And their thought was that the journey, which they planned to be a 3-day adventure, would help them bond as actors, playing a tight-knit gang in some sort of intense method exercise. And so the plan was for them to ride their motorcycles like a gang and sleep on the side of the road like a real motorcycle gang. To be honest, some of them were actually members of an actual motorcycle gang. So they started their 3-day journey, and the first day was a disaster because they really didn't prepare tents. They were just planning on sleeping in the open air, just very cool, and appreciate the nature. However, it rained heavily on that first night, and they were not prepared for so much rain because they didn't prepare tents, and the rain was pouring, and they found a few pieces of long plastic that they hung over a tree branch, and they all slept underneath this piece of plastic. And it was a brutal way to start their journey, but it bonded them as a gang. And on the road, the gang discussed their identities and created the origin story and lore of Toecutter's gang. And the gang continued their 3-day journey and made it to the shooting site at Melbourne. And when they arrived, they were a tight-knit gang. And when the row of motorcycles arrived, the production crew said that it was an awesome sight to behold. They looked dangerous. They were a deadly motorcycle gang who lived and died by their own code. And throughout the shoot, the motorcycle gang stuck together and alienated themselves from the rest of the cast. They went totally method. And so by filming of the movie, Toecutter's gang had lived in the same clothes, lived on their bikes, and were fully immersed into their motorcycle gang roles for months. And it helped create this on-screen image of a real gang with its own society and culture. Now, one of the things that they started to do was to bully and threaten all of the actors who were playing on the police force. And they would even write in fake blood, or maybe it was real blood, things on the walls like, "We're gonna get you, Bronze." And apparently it was really disturbing to be on the other side of that gang. And apparently one of the people who were really disturbed by this was Mel Gibson, and it really got under his skin. Now, originally filming was scheduled to take 10 weeks, 6 weeks of the first unit, and then 4 weeks of stunts and chase sequences. However, 4 days into shooting, Rosie Bailey, who was originally cast as Max's wife, injured herself in a motorcycle accident. She and stunt coordinator Grant Page were riding a motorcycle together during the early stages of production. Grant Page was just giving her a ride on a motorcycle, and they hit an oncoming truck that made a quick right turn. The two collided, and the two on the motorcycle collided into the side of the truck, and she fractured her leg, and they tried to move forward, but it became evidence that she couldn't be in the movie. Production was halted, and Bailey had to be replaced by Joanne Samuel, causing a 2-week delay. As for Grant, who was all bandaged up and in a cast, after 2 weeks he cut off his own cast and went to work doing stunts on the movie. And whenever the crew expressed concern, he just said, "I process pain differently." and continued to work and do stunts. In the end, the shoot lasted 6 weeks in November and December 1977 with a further 6 weeks of second unit work. And the unit reconvened in May 1978 and spent another 2 weeks doing second unit shots and restaging some of the stunts. And in addition to beef up the gangs, they actually got real bike gangs, including the Australian Hells Angels and a gang called the Vigilantes, to come on set. And they used their own bikes and was in this movie, and apparently a lot of them were just paid with beer. And they agreed to be in it for free as long as George Miller and Byron Kennedy got them drunk. And when they finished shooting the film, George Miller and Byron Kennedy actually edited the film in their friend's apartment, and the editing took over 7 months. And at one point, George Miller got burned out and quit the movie. And Byron Kennedy rang up another director named Brian Trenchard Smith and asked if he'd be willing to take over, but he declined. But Trenchard Smith's advice was to hire instead a quality first assistant director to support George. And so they tried to court George Miller back. And after a couple of days, Millie rallied and completed the film, but the crew apparently lost a lot of respect for him during the shoot. And one of the hilarious things about what happened on this shoot came from a police officer named Inspector Blocks. And apparently, members of the cast and crew received a letter from Inspector Blocks of the Victorian Police Department stating that the film crew were filming a movie and that the movie had the support of the Victorian government and to extend the cast and crew every courtesy. Well, everyone who received this letter thought of it as a get-out-of-jail-free card, and it perhaps lowered their threshold for breaking the law. And they sped on their bikes, they got drunk, and they even just broke a lot of traffic rules. Fortunately, no one really committed any serious crimes that necessitated them testing the limits out of this get-out-of-jail-free card. However, just having this letter probably made the cast take a little more risk maybe otherwise would have without the letter. So, only in the 70s. So we start the movie with a dilapidated building, the Hall of Justice, with the letters falling off the sign. And then we get the title, A Few Years From Now. Then we cut to 2 policemen with yellow and blue cars who are just hanging out, and they get this message overhead about a cop killer. And then we pan to a road sign where we see Highway 9 Sector 26, High Fatality Road, Deaths 57. And underneath the sign says monitored by the Maine Force Police Patrol. But we notice that someone has vandalized a sign and replaced the O with an A, so the sign reads Maine Farce Police Patrol. But no one exists in this infrastructure to fix it. And it's a quick and efficient way to tell us everything about the world we're about to enter. So we know that law and order have obviously broken down, the Maine police force are overworked, and we also know that the yellow cars are the good guys. And we know that it's not quite the post-apocalyptic world that we come to associate with Mad Max, it's just one step before. So here, civilization is still barely intact at this point. It's just decayed and it's on the verge of collapse. The buildings are dilapidated, and even the police station is on the verge of collapse. And government offices seem incapable of constructing new buildings. In this society, there is no working infrastructure, and they're simply living out the remains of the previous existing society. And I also like that in this film, you don't really know what happened. And that mystery sort of works for this movie. But of course, after 3 movies, and now we're living in the age of continuity nuts, so there is a backstory. I'll explain a little bit of it here. So apparently in this reality, in the world of Mad Max, Saudi Arabia and Iran have gone to war 10 years before this movie and mutually destroyed each other's oil supply. So as a result, the world's oil supply is vastly decreased and oil prices have suddenly skyrocketed 20 times their original price. And so there are riots in big cities and all the banks have shut down. And apparently countries like Italy and Spain have all gone to martial law. While some countries like Australia, the police forces are still trying desperately to hold up law and order as the city's infrastructure crumbles and massive numbers of people die from disease and starvation, and people scavenge the existing merchandise when the world was actually working. And in the countrysides and the outbacks, gangs begin to rule the road, and this movie takes place about 8 to 10 years after the collapse of the society's infrastructure. So we follow 2 cop killers, the Knight Rider and his girlfriend, who've stolen a police car, and their crazed punk couple who appear to be high on PCP or cocaine or some sort of drug, and he calls himself the Knight Rider, a fuel-injected suicide machine. And while in pursuit, 3 cop cars get destroyed while the villains are still driving free. And here we begin to already see George Miller's talent for creating on-screen tension and suspense. The crashes look convincing and real, and I was quite impressed during the opening of this car chase. And when the police car crashes through a blue bongo van, there's a rumor that this was George Miller's car. Well, sort of. When we see it driving, it is George Miller's bongo van, But then when we see the crash, they were able to get an exact same colored bongo, took out the engine, and it's this junk bongo that the police car crashes through. George Miller's van was fine, and you continue to drive it for a few more years. George Miller said that he wanted to create a silent movie, but with sound. In other words, he wanted to create a kinetic and visceral motion picture with movement and action that would tell the entire story. And from this scene, we can see the silent movie influences. Because George Miller stated that his influences were old silent films of Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd, and we can certainly see those influences here. And this already looks like a professional Hollywood production, not some independent project made by an amateur first-time director who was using his own money. It's really amazing, and no wonder why he'd eventually become one of the top-rated Hollywood directors. When we meet Max's partner Goose, you notice something very interesting, because you've seen the original poster for Mad Max, the one where Max is wearing a helmet with a white face mask. It's an iconic image, and we've seen those posters all the time, where Max is standing facing to the left and looking like he's about to aim a sawed-off shotgun. Well, I just realized that the character on the poster is not Max at all, but it's Goose. Goose is riding an FFP motorcycle, and he actually has on the white helmet and the face mask, and it's a weird thing to realize. Then we meet Max Rockatansky, and he's cool and he's confident and he's calm. And when he faces off with a Knight Rider, they engage in a game of chicken, and the Knight Rider blinks, and Max has won the standoff. And the villain already knows that he's outmatched, and the villain begins to cry as if he has premonitions of his own death, as if he's just encountered his angel of death. And how right he was, because the Knight Rider will die in a fiery crash. And it adds a spiritual dimension to the film, where the Knight Rider not only foresees his own death, but perhaps sees the death of his entire gang at the hands of this angel of death. Now for this crash, George Miller had the idea to try to get a rocket, attach it to Knight Rider's car, and have it propelled into a semi-truck to create this huge, powerful crash. So Byron Kennedy called the Australian Department of Defense and talked to them to see if they could obtain a real military rocket. And who knows what Byron said to the Australian military, but they donated a real rocket to the Mad Max production for free, so it didn't cost them anything. So the crew picked it up, attached it to the back of Knight Rider's car, and planned to have it crash into the truck. And they only had one take to do it. Well, the rocket blasted off, but there was no crash, and none of the crew knew what happened. And they assumed that maybe the car must have become airborne, and so they were looking in the sky for the car. And well, we know from the film, the car actually curved around the truck. And that's because the person was supposed to build the railway, kind of blew off the job and built it too weak, so the car broke the rails and curved around the truck it was supposed to crash in. But overall, the scene still ended up working better than originally planned. We then go to Max's home, where we see that he has a humble but loving family life with an adorable son and a wife who plays the saxophone. So, okay. But it does establish that Max is just a normal guy with a wife and son. And then we find out that Knight Rider's gang is led by Toecutter, who are now looking to get revenge on the police force for killing one of his members. And then we meet Toecutter's gang, and they are vicious, beating up innocents, destroying, murdering, raping anyone they come across. And they are irredeemably bad guys. And we get the sense that they are the law of the town, not the police force. But at the same time, you also get a sense that they are this close-knit society with their own rules and culture and have this loyalty to themselves. It's quite fascinating how three-dimensional the Toecutter's gang is portrayed on screen. So Goose and Max arrest a gang member named Johnny the Boy after the gangs have assaulted an innocent woman. But the gang are able to use a lawyer to get Johnny free. And Jim Goose gets so mad that he beats up Johnny, making him a target for Toecutter's gang's revenge. And Toecutter and the gang ambush Jim Goose on the road, and they burn him alive. And after seeing his burnt friend, Max sees the crazy, unending cycle of violence in his life and fears for his own soul, and he quits the force and decides to live a quiet life with his wife and child in the countryside. He then travels north with his wife, and his wife decides to go for some ice cream, but they run into Toecutter's gang. And while they're being harassed by the gang, we begin to feel this tension in our gut, and it's a very tense scene. And from this point, the movie becomes a roller coaster ride of tension and fear. And I really give prop to George Miller, especially that scene in the woods where his wife is walking through the woods. It is genuinely terrifying. And finally, we get the scene where his wife and son are killed, and it is tragic. And George Miller doesn't actually show us anything. We just see a sock and a ball fly in the air. And it's a very effective, tragic scene. And Mad Max completes his transformation into the actual Angel of Death, and he's gonna clean house. He's gonna lay down the law, and Toecutter's gang is done. And there's just satisfaction when Max gets his revenge, killing the gang one by one. Finally, when the gang of Johnny, Toecutter, and his right-hand man called Bubba ambush Max on the road, shoots him in the leg, and runs over his arm with a motorcycle, even that doesn't stop him. At this point, Max is driven by pure hate and his thirst for revenge, and he continues on his mission of death. And with the explosion of the final gang member, George Miller gives us the film's catharsis. And with Bubba and Toecutter dead, Johnny the boy is easy pickings. And Mad Max finally gets his final revenge. We see Johnny trying to squirm his way out of it. He says, "Hey, listen, I'm not a bad man. I'm sick. What do they call it? I'm psychopathic. I've got a personality disorder. The courts, he said so." And I love this scene. This idea of a criminal trying to get away with what he did by claiming he has a mental disorder. And that's just nuanced and very clever. And Max just ignores him and says, "The chain in those handcuffs is how I tensed steel. It'd take you 10 minutes to cut through it with this." And he hands him a saw and says, "If you're lucky, you get through your ankle in 5 minutes. So go." So Max walks off, and that is just cold-blooded. And the movie ends with an explosion, and our poor hero, our likable and gentle Officer Max Rockatansky, has now begun and has become this full transformation into Mad Max. And what a great film, and so ahead of its time. And this final scene, this scene with a saw where a man has to saw off his own leg, it's going to inspire a lot of movies. And many fans will remember this homage by Rorschach in Alan Moore's miniseries The Watchmen, and it's also homaged by Australian director James Wan, the writer and director and creator of the Saw series. And he has said in interviews that the Saw series and the idea of cutting off his own foot was inspired by the 1979 Mad Max movie. You also have to give props to Mel Gibson, because he's great here, and he looks really good. And we forget how handsome Mel Gibson used to be. He certainly doesn't look like this anymore. And so it is sad that we all have to grow old. And here Gibson electrifies with intensity and charisma. Even before this movie came out, apparently everyone on set knew he was going to be a big star. And he was actually already starting to get offers and auditions to be in more movies. This film was released, and the critical reception was actually mixed, with many critics thought it was fun while others thought it was just way too dark and too violent and incoherent. However, the audiences and the general public loved it. And so did the 1979 AFI Awards, and they actually nominated this film for Best Motion Picture. They also nominated George Miller for Best Director, Best Original Screenplay in George Miller, and the movie won Best Editing, Best Original Movie, Best Original Music Score, and Best Sound. So made on a budget of $400,000, with maybe even going as high as $600,000, the movie was a cult hit in Australia and ended up making $5 million at the box office. It was considered a huge box office success, making 10 times as much money back. And by the time they pulled it from the theaters, it had already made an extra $3 million more, making a total of $8 million. And they would eventually take this movie overseas, where it would become a huge international phenomenon, grossing over $91 million internationally, bringing the worldwide total to $100 million. And that's a huge profit of over 200 times the budget. And for over 20 years, it actually held the Guinness Book of World Record for the largest profit-to-cost ratio, and the record was actually finally broken in 1999 by the movie The Blair Witch Project. Interestingly, the only country where Mad Max did not do so well was in the United States, where the distributor initially botched the US release back in 1979. So this movie could have actually even made more money if the US distributors just did it right. Oh well. However, the next year in 1980, Mad Max was dubbed, with the American actors replacing the Australian accents, and it was released on cable TV, and it did begin to grow as a cult classic. However, in the United States, it was the next film, the 1981 sequel, Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, that was released in the US, where the character of Mad Max became a phenomenon. And this also sparked interest where fans of The Road Warrior went back and discovered this movie. Well, the years have continued to be very kind to this film, and now it is regarded as a modern-day classic and a must-watch movie. And in 2004, the New York Times ranked it among the 1,000 best movies ever. And to this day, it holds a 95% on Rotten Tomatoes. Director George Miller would go on to become a superstar and would also lead Mel Gibson and the Mad Max character to become a very successful franchise. So in 1979, the movie studios will fast-track a sequel, going to George Miller and giving him a lot more money to make the sequel. And he would indeed do that only 2 years later, and that film is going to be called Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior.